I was in tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt. I thought I was the only person in the world that was looking for cheap sex. Every time I saw your face pop up on Instagram, I used to scroll past. I was probably consuming alcohol and drugs 5 times a week. Really got me by the balls, you know. Man, I had a problem, big problem. Because, you know, you've got to be sick of your own shit. We always think we're not going to be that person.
But you haven't actually told me what is going to work. I need a straight answer. What is it that is actually going to help me get out of this? Hello and welcome back to another episode of How to Break Free from Alcohol and Cocaine. Today's guest is very exciting because he's someone that I have over the years got to know incredibly well. His name is Keenan, and he was actually a member of our community. He's someone that we helped to break free from his destructive habits and eventually became a coach within the program that we run. Chris opens up about his early days, the journey to get to where he was, where he reached out to me personally and couldn't see a future where he continued drinking or using substances. He took a leap of faith, he joined our program, and his life has changed an incredible amount. Such an inspiring story, and I have no doubt if you are watching this and you're feeling like you are lost or struggling, this is going to be so valuable for you. I hope you enjoy. And you know, I think it's actually going to be really helpful for a lot of people to hear your story in a bit more depth, because you were a client.
Yes.
Then you became a coach. And now you know a lot of the behind the scenes about how the trail works.
Yeah.
And I think what would be really good for a lot of people, in order to realize that you didn't always used to be like the way you are now, is what was it like before the trail, before we even met?
I think I'll start where I started using alcohol and substances. So I started pretty young, and when I first started, I was just using legal highs. I was using legal highs with alcohol, probably from about the age of 16.
What was a legal high? I don't know if I did poppers, but what was a legal high?
So there was a few that went around. So they did become illegal eventually, but it started off, the first ever substance I consumed was something called shaken vac, which I think is some sort of carpet cleaner.
That was a primary use of it.
I think it was created as a carpet cleaner. I think that mixed with some other stuff, it was still called shaken vac. You're able to snort it, and
You snorted it? Was that powder?
Yeah, it looked exactly like something like Coke. Man, it gave you a big high. But I was able to go to my high street, to my local city, to the high street. It wasn't so much readily accessible, like you weren't walking into a normal shop and just picking it up. But you see like those sort of shops that sell like cannabis paraphernalia and stuff like that are a little bit underground, a little bit dodgy. It was like that, a little bit unregulated, and it wasn't in the shop windows or anything. I remember in this particular shop we went down to a cellar, and in some drawers was this substance, and that was my first experience of substances.
How old were you then?
About 16 probably.
And was the high from that similar to the high that you knew years later from Coke?
It was more intense from that. I don't know if it was the substance itself or the fact that it was the first time I'd consumed substances and I didn't know. You
had nothing to compare it to in terms of highs. I've never really thought about that, but it is true, because the first time I got high from anything was I smoked resin through an Actimel bottle.
Man, wild.
Yeah, like me and my friend made a bong out of a tiny little Actimel bottle, and we smoked resin, and I was smoking, I probably took like 50 or 60 draws because I just wasn't feeling anything. So I thought, let me do another one. And then it all hit me at once, and it was the first time I'd been outside of what I knew was reality, apart from obviously a few drinks at the age of like 14, 15. But yeah, legal highs, I never really, I remember hearing about them, but I never really got into that.
Yeah, and then it transitioned to NCAT, and that one became pretty popular, and then they ended up criminalising it, and yeah, from there it just led on to a chain of really liking these substances.
Was that something you did several times, or was it just the once?
So I suppose a good place to start would be to tell you how I first discovered it or first came about it. It was I was in a pub, and I come from a very small town in the southwest of the UK, and it was the sort of place that you could get away with having a few beers if maybe you weren't 18. You know, you went to the right establishment, you knew the right person, you could maybe have a couple of beers. I don't think they ever allowed you to get silly, but yeah, rules were a bit lax at that point. And I was approached by two girls, and we got chatting, and they were slightly older than me, and I felt very, very cool in that moment. And they were the people that was the first ever substances I tried, was they said, have you ever tried this shaking bag? And I wanted to seem cool, so I said, yeah. And they said, awesome, do you want some? And I was like, yeah, absolutely. And I didn't even know how to take it, so I said, ladies first, go on, you go first, just so I could work out how they were taking it, and I saw them snort it. And in that moment, I felt so many emotions. I felt nervous, I felt excited, I felt important, and I just went with it. And that led to a very late night consuming these substances with these people, and I stayed in contact with these girls, and yeah, they were the one that showed me the shop that you could get it from, and kind of the rest is history from there, really. But that was my gateway into the world of substance.
You said something there which I've never heard anyone say before, which is I felt important. That's a fascinating term to use, because the insinuation is that you are irrelevant without it. And the way in which you took that substance is very similar to the way that I first took coke, which is I pretended that I've done it before. I at that point, I think I knew how to take coke. You roll up a note and snort it. I'd seen movies. But the fear, the anxiety, the racing heart, this doesn't feel like me. Which is interesting because, you know, as we'll get to later on, we always talk about the idea that you've got to change the identity, but technically you're doing that the first time you take drugs. You're changing your identity, because up until I took drugs, I was a non-drug user.
Yeah.
And then the first time I did it, I was like, this doesn't feel like me. And then quickly it does.
Can totally relate to that. I felt like I was living somebody else's life for that particular night, and then it very quickly became my life. And I think the reason I said it made me feel important is because I wasn't a particularly popular child. I wasn't one of the kids at school that, you know, was super popular or anything like that. You know, like a lot of kids, I had a bit of trouble at school, and, you know, wasn't always well liked. I was quite a small kid as well, very short, very slim. So yeah, definitely not one of the cool kids. And in that specific moment, I felt like one of the cool kids. Which is
Quite addictive within itself.
Absolutely.
Not just the high of the drug, but the feeling of belonging.
Man, you go up to any 16-year-old kid that's struggling with his identity, and even without drugs, present two older girls, makes a man feel great. You then throw in a few substances, a few beers.
Yeah. I mean, we could go down a real tangent with this, talking about the idea of being a teenager nowadays and having social media and what that would do to that sense of identity, but we'll park that for another time. But I think what would be interesting to know from this, because even though we've known each other for a substantial amount of time now, it's fascinating to actually hear this, because, and it also proves, as we'll talk about later, getting out of this stage that you were at didn't require having to go back through all of these stages, which most people think is the way to do this. But anyway, back to what you were saying on that is, obviously, that I imagine you say you kept in touch.
Yes.
You did it more and more, and I imagine it started to become just kind of routine and normalized. How did that then escalate from shaken back to something like coke?
So I'm going to skip ahead for quite a few years, because I could talk about the early years. There was so much that happened in those early years, but I think I'd like to skip forward a few years where I was then the person. So I was one of the first people that had this knowledge of these legal highs, and I introduced it to some of my friends. And again, it made me feel that sense of power, because people were coming to me and like, where can you get this substance? And reflecting back, I feel really bad. You know, I introduced it to some people that went down a really dark path. Consequently, they aren't those people anymore, and they're living a really positive life. So I don't hold too much guilt, but for a period of time, it sent them on a really bad path. Now, I'm a firm believer that you can't carry that guilt, because if I hadn't have shown them that day, somebody would have weeks, months, years later. You know, growing up as a as a kid in the UK, and consequently I've come to see it's not just the UK. At the time I thought it was a cultural problem with the UK. At some point throughout your teenage and adult years, you are going to be offered these substances. Whether it was me that offered it or somebody else, at some point they were going to be offered those substances. So on reflection, I now understand that. At the time, I carried around a lot of guilt. So yeah, skipping forward a few years later, because I felt like a sense of belonging, because I'd found almost like this group of party people, and I'd started to transition away from what I guess you would call my real friends that weren't interested. I got more deeply into it, and I started to build more connections, and I started to know people. So when legal highs started to phase out, I started to pick up connections of people that were dealing coke. And again, I was one of the first people that was able to pick up some of these connections. And I think that's because I have older siblings, and I was able to meet people that were a little bit maybe further on in that lifestyle, and yeah, pick up numbers and contacts, and it's kind of how it started to escalate from there.
I can relate to the idea of being the younger kid, because you always used to, I remember this in school, you would aspire to the older kids, and you always knew the name of all the guys in the years above you. And if there was an opportunity to fit in with an older year as a teenager, you just think, that's what I'm going to do. But I think, yeah, when someone's older, they've got more experience, and they can get you to that point. One thing I'd like to know going forward a little bit more is, in the lead up to, let's say, the day that we met, what got you to the point where you wanted to speak to me?
I had a lot of fun with these substances. Throughout my teen years, my early 20s, it really didn't feel like a problem. I wasn't using them particularly regularly, maybe once every couple of months, first of all, then maybe once every couple of weeks. And honestly, I had a lot of fun. I was working part-time jobs. It wasn't really having much of a detrimental effect. Relationships are very fickle in your teen years. So where a lot of people are struggling financially or through relationships or through mental health or physical health, the downsides weren't there for what the upsides were bringing. The upsides were much greater than the downsides at that particular age. As I transitioned into my maybe say mid-20s, it started to become more apparent that the downsides were catching up with the upsides, and the upsides were getting diminished less and less and less, and the downsides were getting larger. And then going into my later 20s, the scales had completely tipped. The downsides were huge, and the upsides were very minimal. You know, it's almost like I was chasing the feeling that I got the first night I used it with those two particular girls, and you know, my first line, that euphoric feeling of feeling like that guy. It's almost like I was chasing that feeling for so many years, and it never really came back. So I started to try and remove drugs myself. At this point, I didn't want to remove alcohol. It was very closely tied to my identity. It's what I did with my friends. I lived in a very small town. I had a very sheltered life for so many years, and I spent every Friday and Saturday night down the boozer. That's just what I did. So the idea of giving up alcohol was like crazy to me, because what am I meant to do? What am I supposed to do every Friday and Saturday night? So that was never the idea. I just wanted to get rid of these substances. Believe it or not, every time I consumed alcohol, it became harder to resist the substances, to where I got to the point in my later 20s where I really struggled to remember a time where I had a couple of beers and didn't have any substances. And it started to creep in from a Friday, Saturday night to maybe one day in the midweek. You know, maybe I'll pop out on a Tuesday evening. And it didn't even need to be with friends. You know, it was just, I built up this relationship with the local pubs that I could walk into a pub and know somebody. And that in many ways made me feel a bit powerful. I'd walk into the pub, and the barmaid behind the bar would greet me, and the locals would stand up and shake my hand or hug me or say hello. And I kind of felt like the man walking into the pub, you know? I was like, everybody knows my name, everybody knows who I am. And that in itself was almost a little bit addictive. but yeah, for sure enough, without removing the alcohol, it's never possible to remove the substances. So I kept going around this perpetual cycle. And then I put two and two together and realised I couldn't drink alcohol if I wanted to not consume substances. So again, I tried that for a period of time, but I was the only person in the world, so I thought, trying to achieve this. And I saw friends around me able to drink without consuming these substances because they hadn't built up the path between them two. And I was like, I just want to be like them. I just want to be able to go out and have a couple of beers, enjoy myself, and not consume substances. But that just wasn't me. You know, we are very all or nothing type people, both you and I, and everybody within our community, actually. So that wasn't possible for me personally. And I got to a point where I realised I wasn't going to be able to do it on my own. And I'd probably been watching you on Instagram at this point for maybe 6 months. And I reached out to you in, I think maybe around March of 2023. And I'd said to you that I want to stop doing these substances. Can you help me? And we were talking on Instagram, and you said, are you ready to give up alcohol? Or do you'd worked out that alcohol was a trigger for me. And I said, no, I don't want to give up the alcohol. And you said, pretty much said, contact me when you do want to give up the alcohol because you're not willing to remove your trigger. The support's not going to work. And I was like, oh, what a dick.
Yeah, most people think that.
I was like, what a dick. And then every time I saw your face pop up on Instagram, I used to scroll past, but I kept you on Instagram because I really resonated with what you were saying. It's like every time I saw a reel of yours, it was like you were speaking to me. And sometimes when I was struggling, I'd sit and watch your reels. And then in the November, I reached back out to you, and I thought, you know what, things had got really bad at that point. We've skipped quite a bit further ahead now, but at this point, I'd broken up from a long-term relationship that was a bit destructive in itself anyway. And that was the final boundary or rules that I had in place, right, was this relationship. So once that ended, man, makes me feel guilty talking about it to some sense, but I was probably consuming alcohol and drugs 4, sometimes 5 times a week. And it just really, really, it really got me by the balls, you know? And I was like, So I reached back out to you, and yeah, you said happy to jump on a call, which was really surprising to me because at the time you'd had around 70,000 Instagram followers. And I was like, wow, this guy is speaking to me, you know, and is willing to jump on a call with me. And that really surprised me because, you know, you've got to remember, even 2.5 years ago, social media was much smaller than it is now. You know, you see quite a few people these days with 70,000 followers, but even 2.5 years ago, that was what you deemed to be somebody quite big in the space. So, yeah, and then I jumped on a call with you.
We spoke about this the other day, but I feel like because of the amount of people who are struggling and the amount of calls we have come in, it can, in that moment, be that you're jumping on a call which could potentially change the course of your life. And in that moment, it absolutely did. And I feel like you might be able to remember the details of that call slightly sharper than I can.
I remember it so well.
And I'd love to hear what that call was like.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm sure we'll come on to my career working with you a little bit later into it, but I now see how much outreach you have and how many people are struggling. So, of course, you're not going to remember every call you jump on because there's a lot of them. But for me and for everybody that jumps, you know, is brave enough to reach out and jump on a call with you, that is a pivotal moment in their life. So I remember the call so well. I remember exactly where I was sat. I remember exactly what I was thinking.
I remember the beard you had.
Yeah, big old bushy beard. And and I jumped on that call. And there were so many times that I nearly didn't jump on that call. I was in a very, very short relationship at that point, and maybe it wasn't the most constructive relationship. And, you know, she'd sort of said to me, you don't need that. As people do, you haven't got that much of a problem. We've talked, you know, I know you and we talked to the community about it, that the outside world just doesn't see it. I held down a full-time job. I was running. I seemingly had money. My physical health seemed to be okay. I portrayed a good mental health. So people would always say to me, you ain't got a problem. Man, I had a problem, a big problem. So we jumped on that call, and it was surreal to see your face. And it's interesting now because I know you so well. You know, we work together. We've spent, you know, time together in Thailand over the course of the last few months, so we know each other very well now. But at that time, you were this influencer, this public figure, this person that would pop up on my Instagram screen, and suddenly I'm sat on a call with you, and in itself that was a little bit overwhelming. So it was probably the first time that I'd spoken to anybody completely openly and honestly. And I think you have a real art of being able to allow people to do that, you know, just create space like this, like you are right now. And I remember that sense of instant relief that I've finally been able to speak about all of these things that I've wanted to scream from the rooftops, but have been too scared of what people might think or say or judge. And you weren't judgmental at all. And you could relate to it all because you'd been through very, very similar things to me. The thing is, everybody is leading such different lives, but the core problems, the areas it's affecting, it's always the same. And I ran through my story with you, and then you asked me what I wanted. And I said, I want some help. I want some support. And you said, okay, well, let me show you what we do. And that was the first time that I'd heard of this program, this project, whatever you want to call it, the Teetotal Trail. And you ran through what feels now like a very, very dated run through of the program. It's changed a lot in the last 2.5 years. And I loved the idea of it. I loved the idea of being able to join a space where other people understood, where people weren't going to be judgmental, where people weren't going to say, oh, it's not that bad of a problem. And I love the idea of it. And I also remember being nervous because before I contacted you, I went to one AA meeting and I struggled to relate to the people. Now, I'm not one to have a drug hierarchy or a life hierarchy, but the people that said you haven't got a problem were wrong. But what they were right about is I did have all of the things they were talking about. I was in full-time employment. I did have some level of physical health. And I sat in this meeting with people that didn't have those things. And in a purely non-judgmental way, I couldn't relate to them. They were so much further down this path of destruction that I just couldn't relate to them. I could see how I could end up there, but I needed a community of people that were at a similar level to me, were struggling with the same things. And when you explained a bit about the community, that's what it sounded like it was. And I was so excited to be able to speak to people openly and honestly about it. And a lot of what we do now is our communications come through WhatsApp and things like that. At the time, it was Facebook. You know, again, we're talking 2.5 years ago. And I remember as you were running through the community, you showed me all of these different chats on Facebook. And it was like, you know, challenges and struggles or cocaine or wins and all of these different things. And I was like, wow, imagine having all of these different spaces that I can talk about open and honestly what I've been going through. And yeah, you ran through the program, you ran through the investment into the program, you told me how it would change my life or could change my life. I don't think I necessarily believed you in that point, but I was excited to give it a go.
Well, I also remember from that call that you said, I'll do it, but afterwards, I'm going to moderate my drinking.
Yeah.
The goal was not to stop for good.
It was to stop for 6 months, right?
Yeah.
So my idea was I had two major goals when I entered the Teetotal Trail. One was to not drink for 6 months, and the second was to run a half marathon.
I remember. How's that gone?
I did the half marathon. And last year I ran an ultra marathon. So, yeah, I think I entered with the idea of running 22 kilometers, and I haven't left, but I've achieved running 100 kilometers, which is quite substantially more, right?
It's wild. And I think it'd be a good thing to talk about as well. One thing, and you're right, you know, it's a scary thing. Like you see it as well as I do now. That sense of relief of I've actually done something about this. I'm no longer just a spectator watching this, scrolling past the videos. I'm on a call with him, I'm doing it, and you took action. And for a lot of people, that can be such a huge part of it, just being like, I am doing something about it, I'm proud of myself. And I remember you coming in saying, I'm going to do 6 months. And I said that's the beauty of it. No one's going to tell you not to drink. You can do whatever you want. It's your life. And you don't have to make a decision now. Make a decision in 6 months. Does it have value? Do you want to go back to it? Do you want to carry on? And I remember it was quite early on, maybe a couple of weeks in, you were like, okay, no, I'm done. I'm done.
I very quickly saw the benefits of the lifestyle, and just being surrounded by inspirational people achieving the same thing. Because when I entered the community, there were people in there that were coming up to a year sober. In fact, there were people past it. The coaches on the program were past a year, and they would talk, and you would talk about how your life had changed in so many positive ways. And I just thought, wow, I would love to live the life that these guys are living. I would love to have that sense of freedom and not that sense of tie to alcohol or these substances. And I decided very quickly that the amount my life had changed in the space of the first month, I never want to go back. I never, ever, ever want to go back. And yeah, I decided that very early on. And did I believe that I wanted to moderate my drinking after 6 months? I'm not really sure. But one thing I do know is it made it seem less scary, because you were accepting of it. You went, cool, let's do 6 months and see how you get on. Whereas I'd been told previously, you need to never drink again. You know? That was, as I say, I only went to one AA meeting, but that was the message. You don't ever get to drink again. It is going to ruin your life if you ever touch another drop of alcohol. And that was terrifying to me.
Yeah, I had a similar experience, but the thing is, it's not wrong. You know, alcohol, if we carried on drinking, it would destroy our lives. But there's no benefit to putting that pressure on someone when it's a scary step to take, and it's like, only take this step if you're going to go and never drink it, because forever is such a concept that just doesn't make sense. And that's what stopped me taking action for so many years, is I don't know how to stop forever. But the reality is, if you can stop for a day, you can stop for 2. If you can stop for 2, you can stop for a week. And just kind of incrementally going up and being like, there's no pressure. You can always go back to it if you want. But just get to the point where, does it make sense? And the longer you're out of it, the more you start to realize what was taking you there in the first place. And the work seems to be infinite, which is a blessing and a challenge at the same time. But I think I do remember the day when you were like, no, I'm done. And you fully committed. I remember you being on so many calls, you were open, you were sharing, and you were just most of the time running.
Yeah, I just wanted it so badly. You know, and we use this term, or I use this term, and I think I've coined it from the community, which is, you know, you've got to be sick of your own shit. And I was fully there, man. I had let myself down and other people down for so many years that I was just so ready to make the change. And you can have all the will and all the want and all the knowledge in the world, but if you're not at that stage where you really want it, where you're willing to do what it takes to really make it happen, it's not going to work.
Absolutely. So what happened after 6 months?
So after 6 months, I actually had a conversation with you around whether I wanted to leave the community. and we'd come up with an agreement where I was going to do another 6 months in the community and solidify my journey, get me to a year. And it's something I now say to people, but it's something that I've picked up from you, which is the nice thing about a year is you've done everything once. So you've done a winter, an autumn, a summer, you've probably done a stag do, a wedding, a birthday, a Christmas, and they're all a little bit different. My triggers in the summer were very different from my triggers in the winter. My triggers in the winter were loneliness and lack of connection and dark and cold nights. My triggers in the summer were the opposite. They were surrounded by connection, pubs, beer gardens. You know, I lived coastally, so late night beach parties. So the triggers that presented over summer were completely different to winter. Neither was particularly harder than the other one. They were just different. So it made a lot of sense to me to stay for a year.
Yeah, I think, well, it's obviously now on the trail, it makes sense so clearly that doing 6 months is not enough. And the common misconception is, let me do dry January. I get to the end of it. I've cracked this. I'm done. And, you know, there is that kind of superhero effect that we see, which is usually around 4 to 6 weeks of, I can do this. It's so easy. Followed swiftly by, again, what we coin, or should we say Adam, our fellow coach, coined the Valley of the Shadows, which is 6 to 8 weeks. The novelty has started to wear off. I'm starting to feel like a bit flat. Is this really it? Maybe I've proved I can do it. Maybe I could go back and manage it now. And that's the danger zone of like 6 to 8 weeks, 6 to 10 weeks is where we see a lot of people slip up. And the next challenge of that is, I've slipped up, I've failed, I can't do this, I'm too embarrassed to share it, I'm going to go and carry on. And that's why it's so important to have a non-judgmental space of, it's okay. Slip-ups can be expected, and in fact can be very valuable to learning how to not go back to it again. We need to recognize, what was the trigger, what emotions were you feeling? Were you feeling disconnected? Were you feeling stressed or isolated, bored, even hungry or thirsty? Simple things like that. And from our perspective now, we know there are challenges at 3 months you'll never experience after a month. We know there are challenges at 6 months you'll never experience at month 4. I know on my journey there's challenges at year 3 that you won't experience in year 1. And that's what is so fascinating and why it's so valuable to have someone who's further ahead and to trust what that person is saying. And you were trusting. You were trusting that I've not been in this space before. I've never done this long in my adult life without substances. I'm in no man's land. And the reason I believe you're sat here now is because you did trust that.
Yeah, trusted the process wholeheartedly, because one thing that you have with a community that you don't have on your own is undeniable evidence that people further ahead of you are changing their lives. You can see it in people. You can see how much lighter they are. You can see relationships repairing. You can see financial situations repairing. You know, you can see one of my favorite things about the Teetotal Trail is visually seeing somebody come into the trail where they just look, oh man, you know, they just look beaten up, you know? Somebody can look after themselves as much as they want, but you look beaten up by life when you're struggling with these substances, and you've got that red and puffy look, and yeah, you just look a little bit, I think beaten up is the best word for it. And as you see people's journeys progress, they get a lightness to them. You know, obviously you get the obvious stuff. Your skin gets better. You tend to lose weight. You know, all of these sorts of things, but it's the lightness that you see in people, the colour in their eyes. You see life come back into people's eyes, and it's amazing because you see them enter in one way, and sometimes it's as short as a month, 2 months, 3 months. The light comes back in their eyes and they just feel so much lighter. And I think that's genuinely one of my favourite things about the programme.
That's what I saw in you.
It's cool to hear.
Yeah. And it's wild because, you know, sometimes we get people to, if they're comfortable, to share in the community the before and after photos. Like, this is what I was like, this is what I look like now. And yours were always really like, I just can't recognise you. It was like you were such a different person. And like you say, you know, we've spent more and more time together over the past year, and I'm, you know, starting to learn more about you, and it's it's amazing just how big the transformation is, because obviously from my perspective, I was always like, wow, I went from that guy to this guy. And it was a hell of a transformation for me. But it was for you as well. And, you know, you talking back, you know, that day that you jumped on a call with me, I'm sure there was no part of your mind that thought you'd be sat here having a conversation talking about this.
My expectations were high because I knew what this lifestyle had done for people. As soon as I entered the community, my expectations were high because I suddenly had role models and people around me that I could mimic, that I could, you know, try to achieve the things that they were achieving. But it surpassed every expectation I had in so many different ways. Physically, mentally, emotionally, financially. You know, it's... I don't know if we've ever had the conversation, but when I found out there was a financial investment into the program, or the price of the financial investment, my brain instantly went, you've lost so much money through drink and drugs. Don't lose any more. And to sit here and say that now, it seems crazy to me because I have such a different mindset about investing into myself now. I invest into myself in so many areas now. But at the time, that was my main mindset. You don't have the money. I was in debt. I was in tens of thousands of pounds worth of debt. I didn't have money. But as we know, if you want something enough, you'll find the money. I never struggled to find the money for substances. One way or another, I made it work. And I had to apply that mindset to this. And I was like, I have to make this work. And I looked at my NOMO, my sobriety tracking app recently, and I think it says over the course of the last 2.5 years, I've saved £27,000. Don't ask me where it is, Will, because it's not in my bank account.
It'd be too much travelling.
But it has funded a lot of travel. It's funded a lot of investment into myself. I've lived such a higher quality of life than I would have. And that's way better than money in the bank, right?
I would agree. I would agree. But it's an interesting thought, the idea that whatever you want most, you will find money for, because I would spend my entire paycheck and I'd still find a way to buy Coke.
Mm.
And I guess the question is, do you think because you invested in yourself, that's why you committed the way you did?
100%. Because at the start, what gets you through? It's the fact that you've invested financially into yourself. And it's crazy now that was my biggest motivator, because these days it's not a motivator for me. But at that particular time, it was like you said there, you attended a lot of the group calls. Damn straight I did. I was paying for it. I'm soaking up every bit of value I can get. You know, I've paid for a service, so I'm going to use it and use it as much as I can. And I remember sitting down and planning my week around the group calls and, you know, my one-to-one coaching sessions. And I was like, I'm going to make the most of this money that I've invested into myself. And thank God I did, because, you know, it's completely changed my life.
I think that can be an interesting mindset, which I used to have, which is everyone deserves free help. And everyone deserves to have access to help. I truly believe that. That's why we help people for free as well. But when the trail started, it was free. And looking back at the data and the statistics, was the success rate of getting people to where they wanted to be was substantially lower because it was free. You look at free services like 12-step programs and the reports that come out of those, and the incredibly low success rates and therefore incredibly high fail rates of those programs, is because I see people are not just invested financially, but with that financial investment comes the emotional and the mental investment of, I'm going to give this everything I've got. And like you, I've invested so much into myself, not just financially, but I've invested time, focus, attention, energy into the things that I wanted and the areas that I wanted my life to improve, whether it be my nutrition, my fitness, my sleep, my friendships, my relationship. And it's only ever been more than worth it doing those things. And I'd love to talk about when the time on the trail came to an end for you. It wasn't an end, it was a transition. And for anyone that doesn't know, you are a coach on the Teetotal Trail, as well as Anna and Adam, our other two coaches. And I'd love to know what that was like to transition whilst inside the trail.
Well, firstly, I think the first point of reference that would be good to go back to is probably about a month into my journey, where I remember exactly where I was, and I'd left you a voice message, and I was actually a bit nervous about leaving you this voice message on WhatsApp. And I said to you, if there's ever an opportunity to get involved with the trail, and I didn't really know what I meant by that. I didn't necessarily mean coaching, or, you know, I loved what was being created and I saw the value in it. And even from the early stages, although I was helping myself, I loved helping other people. It gave me a sense of purpose and accountability. So I left you a voice message and I said, listen, if there's ever anything I can do for the trail, you know, let me know. And you left me a really nice voice message back saying, I love the idea. Thank you so much for this, but focus on your own journey for now. And that was some really valuable advice, because it didn't mean that I couldn't help people, but what it meant is put myself first, and then if there's time and energy to support others afterwards, awesome. So that was my first thought of maybe I could do something with this. And as the program went on, I suppose 6 months into my journey, when I was thinking about leaving the trail, there must have been, I'd actually be interested to know this from you, because I've never asked you this question, but you suggested I do another 6 months on the program, which I agreed with. But when I said I was going to go at 6 months, was there any idea of me being a part of the program at that point?
Yes, absolutely. And I think in my mind, from very early on, probably within the first month, probably even maybe before you sent me that voice note, I could see the way in which you interacted with other people, the logic that you approached everything with, the commitment, the compassion. I knew very early on that you would be part of this program, but I couldn't have you part of it if you weren't fully out of it yourself. Because the worst thing would be is someone to coach on the program who is a flight risk, and it's very hard to trust your coach if they are not absolutely rock solid. And I'm sure the reason why you trusted me, because I am so rock solid. And I'd love to hear if you think otherwise, but I don't think I've ever wavered.
Never.
In anything that I do. And I needed you to get to that point first.
Yeah, I totally see that and understand that now. And it was 11 months in, I remember it was 11 months in where we had the first conversation, and it was on the back of one of our Teetotal meetups. And we'd talked a little bit during the meetup, and we decided we were going to go for a gym session after the meetup. And I remember being nervous at this gym session because I was like, I want to ask him before I leave the program if there's any way that I can help out with the program.
I thought you'd be nervous about the workout and what I was making you do.
Maybe that a little bit as well. Man, I've never ached so much from kettlebells.
Those kettlebells.
And I was really nervous, and I went to bring it up a few different times, and we were having a gym session. I was like, no, just leave it for now, leave it for now, leave it for now. And then we had a sauna. I don't know if I'm sure you do remember, but we had a sauna after the workout. And I was like, this is the moment we're sat in silence, or we're talking. I was like, this is where I'm going to ask him. And I remember saying to you, I've got something that I'd love to ask you, which is, could I get on board on, maybe coming and working for the trail, because I love what we're doing and I'm not ready to leave yet. And your first response was, I thought you'd never ask. And it instantly made me feel so much less nervous about having the conversation with you.
But we went for dinner afterwards. I remember that dinner because you told me that you didn't know if you were ready to coach people.
Yeah.
And you remember what I said to you?
You told me I was ready.
I told you you'd been coaching people for months already, you just didn't know it. The amount of times on calls you were holding space for people, you were asking people questions, you were giving people really solid advice. And I assured you that is not the part that you need to worry about, because you thought, I don't know if I'm ready to be a coach. And obviously it's been proven that all you needed was that self-belief that you are ready. And since then it's been
amazing.
It's been amazing.
I think one thing that I was nervous about is, I don't want to downplay any other coaching role, but there's a lot of coaching you can do where the detrimental effect isn't catastrophic. I'm going to take fitness coaching as an example, just because it's a massive thing, right? Fitness coaching is a massive thing. If you
prepare to watch the comments on this video.
Oh, I'm sure. But if you are a bad fitness coach, and there is plenty of them out there, there's also some amazing ones, but if you're a bad fitness coach, the worst case scenario is somebody doesn't get the results. They don't lose the weight, they don't get leaner, they don't put on the muscle, whatever the goal is. The downside to being a bad coach on what we do can be catastrophic. People are killing themselves because of this. And I didn't want to not be good enough and ruin someone's chances of getting out of this, because I saw how much it had changed my life, and I still feel this massive sense of responsibility to the people that I coach. It's easy to become desensitized to what we do because we do it every day, but we're changing people's lives. You changed my life. You completely changed the trajectory of my life. That first call I had with you that day set me on a completely different path. And over the last 2.5 years, where I would have been and where I am now have got further and further and further apart, and that's 2.5 years. Imagine in a decade, I don't know where my life was heading, and I never will know, because I'll never be in that place. But I do know that it is a very, very different space. And this might be a little bit off topic, but what we've been doing for the last couple of months, which is traveling around Thailand, is so far removed from a lifestyle that I lived. I lived in a very small town. I had a very small town mentality. Never really, I went on holiday a couple of times to France, went to Spain once. But what I thought I was able to achieve in life was very constricted. And now I have such a bigger and wider mindset of what I want to achieve. And currently traveling in Asia is mind-blowing to me, because there is a version of me just a few years ago that can't achieve that. Will never achieve that. And a really poignant part of my journey was when I hiked around the Tour de Mont Blanc. And I woke up with such immense gratitude every day that my eyes were seeing the most beautiful sights, and there is a version of me that is still stuck in that cycle that never sees those sights. And I got emotional when I was, walking through these mountains, and I was like, because of the work that I've put in, a lot of support, but fundamentally I had to put the work in to achieve that. My eyes are seeing things that they would have never had the opportunity to see.
I love that. And I think there's something to be said, because, for me, one thing I always loved was I wanted to explore, I wanted to travel. And I truly believe that sense of adventure doesn't necessarily come from the place that you're going to, and the idea that anyone could have, whilst they're in the session, they could have booked a flight to France and done the same walk as you. But the difference is how you're processing what's happening around you. And I think, people come to Thailand all the time on holiday and they drink. And the difference for me is when you embrace that sense of adventure in every sense of the word, not just physically or locationally, but the sense of adventure within yourself, and you go on that journey, the way in which you interact with the world, the way in which you feel emotions, and as the hero Tony Robbins says, the quality of your life is directly linked to the quality of your emotions. You could be here, but if you're not feeling the best you've felt, it's going to be no different. I realize your environment does make a difference. It definitely does. But unless you've done that work to really go inside and meet yourself and heal whatever needs to be healed and process what needs to be processed, that part for me is irrelevant. But the fact that when you were doing that hike around Mont Blanc, not only were you seeing it, but you were processing what you were seeing differently.
Mm.
And I think that's the difference.
Makes a lot of sense. You can have an experience with two completely different mindsets. And I've seen it whilst I've been around Thailand. I've been to the south, I've been to certain islands where there's a bit more of a party vibe. Honestly, I didn't like them as much. But you can see that people are there for very different reasons. Something else that blows my mind is the amount of English pubs or English style pubs. People come all of this way to sit inside an English style pub and not even see Thailand. And the interesting thing is, that would have been me. It was me. I went to Spain and did the exact same thing.
Yeah. What happened after you became a coach? What did that do for your journey, and what was it like speaking to people who were in the same place you were in?
It was eye-opening because, as I mentioned earlier, I really thought drink and drugs were a culture problem in the UK. And I now have an insight that so many more people are struggling than I thought. Men, women, young men and women, older men and women, jobs spanning from young labourers to business owners much later on in their career, people who live in the UK, people who live in Australia, people who live in South America. And it was mind-blowing to know that this is not a culture problem with the UK. It is a problem that so many people are experiencing and nobody's talking about it, which is crazy.
I sometimes find that interesting when we're running a group call and you look on the screen and you're looking at people from every corner of the earth, and you sometimes think these people would never have the chance to connect, and they're so different in who they are fundamentally as people, or the jobs they lead, or the lives they live, but we all have one common denominator, which is we have struggled with either alcohol or coke or both, and we want a better life. And it's amazing that you can put people in a room who all have the same job and you think they must connect, but in fact that's the surface level part. What's deeper is who we are authentically, and the connection that I see, that you see, that we both feel inside that community is unlike anything I've experienced before. And obviously it's strange me saying that because it was me who started it, but that's exactly what I wanted it to be. Somewhere where you can just be authentic and just be yourself. You don't have to put that front up anymore.
How many times do we hear, and I felt this myself, we hear people say, I've spoken to the community about things that I've not even spoken to my best friend about, my partner about, my parents about. And it's exactly what you explained there. It's because of that sense of connection and belonging. And a lot of the time it might be someone behind a computer screen, but there is so much love and compassion and understanding in that group because we've all been in that dark place. We've all been in that very, very dark place where it feels like the walls are coming in on you. And when I said people aren't talking about it, I think that's the side of it I meant. People are talking about alcohol, people are talking about drugs, but they're talking about the good times. They're talking about the nights out. They're not talking about that moment at 4 a.m. where you're lying on your bed, looking at the ceiling, wondering how you've got in that position again, feeling guilty about things you've done. And I actually, if you're okay with it, I actually wanted to just spend a moment talking about, I don't ever like to sit and glamorize or, really get too deep in the dark stuff because it's actually quite irrelevant to the journey often. But I think where it is relevant is so many people are experiencing the same things and nobody's talking about it. And an example of that is how closely sex is linked to drugs or dopamine. And I never heard anybody talking about it. I thought I was the only person in the world that was looking for cheap sex or sitting there for hours scrolling through different porn sites, or it turned me into somebody that I really wasn't, that I felt incredibly guilty about. And I carried this guilt so heavily. And then you start to realize everybody's experiencing the same thing. Everybody is taking actions that the sober version of them doesn't agree with. You know, whether that be sending messages to people you shouldn't be, watching videos you shouldn't be, you know, all of these various different things.
Personally, the guilt of that behavior was one of the major factors that made me stop. And it was interesting, maybe a year or two ago, there was a guy who joined the program, and he said, look, before I go in there, there's something you need to know. And I was like, of course. He's like, now it's a bit strange, and you've probably never come across it before, but it's something that happens after I do drugs. And I went, is it porn or prostitution? And he was like, how did you know? I went, oh, same as all of us.
Everybody's struggling with it. Nobody's talking about it. Everyone's struggling with it.
And that is probably where a lot, as a man, that's where a lot of the guilt and shame lies in the behavior. And, you know, we've used terms like feral, which a lot of people can relate to. And of course, now you look on social media, there's more guys talking about it in a jovial way and, you know, joking about it. But it was, you know, the deep sense of shame around your behavior after drink and drugs would make you feel so pathetic, was the word that I used to use for myself.
I'd say grimy. I felt grimy. I felt it was so unaligned with the person that I was or wanted to be. It just wasn't me. It turned me into this creature, you know. And I know that trying to think about, you know, obviously Dapper Laughs now has, you know, he talks about sobriety a lot, but he used to cultivate this creature called the Sesh Gremlin. Remember his old skits?
Yeah.
And was very jovial and jokey, like you said, but my God, was it accurate.
I think being on the perspective that we have now and realizing that almost every guy goes through that, it changed the way in which I saw myself back then. Like I said, I used the word pathetic, which was very judgmental and negative towards myself. And now I realize it's not me, it's the substance. As in, you take that substance and your brain goes on a mad rush of I need as much dopamine as possible. Gambling is a big part of that as well. And that was something that I did a lot. And you realize when you're in that state, it was anything that gave you a hit, even if it went against your entire moral code or the person that I think I am. And we had this conversation on a group call the other day of the idea of the blue zones in the world and people living longest. And it turns out the reason why they live so long is because they're so authentically aligned with who they are. Because if you're not, there is a chronic level of stress that just constantly eats away at your body. And I realized back then, you know, we used to joke about it being Jekyll and Hyde, the idea that daytime I was this guy, but at nighttime I was this guy. And they were polar opposites. Daytime I would go to work and I would be so professional, so on the ball. Everyone would see me and respect me and there was a reputation. But if they truly knew what was happening late at night, in the middle of the night, after I've done a load of coke, most people wouldn't believe it. But that's also why most people said I didn't have a problem, because they didn't see that side. I was the only person that saw that side, and a few other unlucky souls. And that was the huge motivator for me that catapulted me to the man I am today.
Absolutely. And something I'd love to acknowledge what you said there is the gambling. And I want to talk about this a little bit because I'd love to speak to some people that are just at the start of their journey of consuming these substances, because when I first started consuming them, I didn't sit there on porn sites. It wasn't closely tied to sex. I didn't sit there gambling. It was social, it was fun. I was out on the beers with the boys, a couple of lines. I was consuming much less, so I might sleep a little bit. It was only years on where that demon come out. That person that I really hated, the person that was scrolling those adult sites, that person that was just sat there playing slots or roulette on their phone, and it went from the thing that was so fun, so social, to something that was so isolating, felt so damaging, felt so lonely. And that's where you're not living authentically. That Jacqueline Hyde that you talk about, I can relate to it so much. The person that I was in the day, turning up professionally to work, was completely different from the person that I was when I consumed those substances, particularly in the later years. And I really want to mention that, because people always think, that would never be me. I thought it, that would never be me. It will if you carry on. And the reason that I can say it will and not it might be is because we have the hindsight of speaking to hundreds, if not thousands of people, and it always ends the same way.
I think it's more thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people.
Exactly.
And it always does. And I think especially what I used in the beginning, which was my opinions, have now transitioned into just using data. And we have so much data now of watching behaviour, seeing what works, seeing what doesn't work, monitoring it all very, very closely, so we can very confidently say what will happen.
Yeah.
Most of the time, without exception. And the only way I see people really breaking free from this is when they listen to that. When they accept the stats and stop trying to think that they are an exception to the rule.
Human psychology, right? We always think we're not going to be that person.
Until we are.
Why would it affect the other 7 billion people in the world, not you? You know, I'm not saying that, everybody in the world is struggling with this problem, but you always, whether it's drinking drugs or something else, you always think you're the exception to the rule. That won't be me. People who have lost everything, they never planned for that. They never thought they would be that person. We are all so much closer to that than we ever realise. And I had a huge ego, a massive ego. I think anybody who consumes a lot of substances and drink does. You've talked about it yourself. You had a huge ego. Pretty much everybody in our community, whilst consuming these substances, had a huge ego. And with that ego comes, I'm better than that, or that won't be me. Drop the ego, because you are dangerously close to it.
Agreed. There might be people watching this or listening to this and thinking, I resonate with so much, that's me. And most likely there's a lot of people thinking that. That's me. But you haven't actually told me what is going to work. I've tried 12 steps, I've done all these things. I need a straight answer. What is it that is actually going to help me get out of this? And usually that would be me explaining. But this is a unique position where I've got you here, and I'm like, it'd be good to hear your side of that. If someone came to you and said, how do I break free from that cycle? What would you say?
For me, it was finding a community. And I always say to people, that community doesn't have to be our community. And I feel less comfortable speaking about this now I'm actually part of the Teetotal Trail. It felt more comfortable for me when I was just a client, because people might sometimes think, oh, he has an incentive to speak about this. All I can speak about is how I changed my life, because that's what I have knowledge of. And I don't advocate for the Teetotal Trail because I'm a coach on it. I advocate for it because I spent a year as a client on it, and that's where it changed my life. Coaching for the Teetotal Trail was amazing. That's not the bit that changed my life. The bit that changed my life was entering it as a client, finding people that I could resonate with, that understood what I was going through, and that sense of accountability and community and connection. Yeah, I've done a lot of learning throughout it. I've educated myself a lot through it, but anybody can educate themselves. You can go on ChatGPT right now and say, give me 10 things that will help me stop drinking. Great, but they're not practical. You don't have any accountability to that. It's the same reason that people have PTs. There are hundreds of thousands of pieces of literature out there about what to do at the gym. Why don't people do it? Because they haven't got that accountability. And that was, for me, the missing piece. The accountability, the guidance, and feeling part of something that people understood. So find yourself a community.
It's the one thing we see. People go, do you know what? I think I've got this. I think I can do it on my own. And we feel a duty to tell them what we know, which is we don't see people do it on their own. The reason why we're here is because we didn't do it on our own.
Exactly.
As much as I didn't have the trail when I did it, I found people to help me. I didn't keep it to myself. And I realized that that is the last thing that people want to do, but the most important thing that people should be doing if they want to achieve the goal of, I want to get this out of my life for good. And again, you know, I tried 12 steps and I saw that one option was to be part of this forever. And that I didn't like. I much prefer the idea that this is something I can deal with and be done with. I don't have to think about it again. Obviously, the irony is, 8 years on, we're sat here talking about it, but not in a way that I feel like I need to talk about it to stay away from it. It's just not who I am anymore. And that was what I found to be the most important part of this entire process, is once you find that accountability and you find that community where you truly align, this isn't forever. It is in terms of you get your life back, but you don't have to do this work forever. In fact, it can be something where you rewire your brain, become someone who just doesn't have space or time or even think about those substances, and then you're good. And you can, as you've seen a lot of people do, graduate the program, go on, and actually then start living their lives.
Yeah.
And if I was to tell someone who's struggling, look, it might take 10 months, could take 12 months, it seems like an extraordinarily long amount of time to put in work or to work towards it. But of course, at that point, you think that the work is going to be not enjoyable, when in fact, when it is enjoyable,
so much,
you're happy to keep doing it. But in the grand scheme of your life, you either keep struggling as you are for what is going to be the harsh reality, a much shorter life, or you put in the work, enjoy it, and get your life back for the rest of your life, which will probably be longer. That's a pretty good deal.
A year feels like a long time until you realise that most people that are resonating with this have probably been drinking or doing drugs for many years. A lot of people listening to this, decades. To shift your sense of identity, to rewire some behaviours, if you can rewire decades worth of behaviours in 12 months, I'd say that's a pretty good return on investment. And I love what you said there, because when I entered, there was an element of I'm just going to have to continually work and work and work at this. There were some really hard times, Will, where that Valley of the Shadows period, I actually talked to you about this the other day, but it's not something I've mentioned very much. Friday nights used to be a huge trigger for me. And we have a community call on a Friday night, but I used to finish work early on a Friday. So I would walk into the hills, and the reason that I'd walk into the hills is because I was walking away from where I could pick up drugs or go to the pubs. I'd spend a few hours walking into the hills until the craving subsided or got easier, and then I knew that I could jump on a call in the evening and talk about what it was that was bothering me, and that was the massive game changer. But that was only a period of time. I did that maybe for a few weeks or a month of where it was uncomfortable that every Friday. And then life just started to get better. And although there's still work to be done between 6 and 12 months, it's pretty pleasurable work. You've already made so much of the shift that the cravings and the triggers, they don't happen very often. They're not gone. I still got the occasional craving at 7 months. I remember getting my final one at 7 months, and it was pretty strong. It was in my hometown. It was a beautiful day. I saw people drinking in the beer garden. I had this overwhelming thought of, wouldn't it be nice to have a few beers? But they went from happening every Friday, or I suppose at some point a couple of times a week, but Friday particularly, to just getting further and further apart. And the longer I was on the journey, certainly that 6 month period, it's maybe getting a silly thought once a month. It's very manageable. Still work to be done, but very manageable. And everything was improving by that point. My running was getting better, my mental health was getting better, my finances were recovering, my relationships were improving.
It's so good, and you're a classic example of someone who puts the work in and gets to where you are today. And of course, it's really enjoyable for me right now to have this conversation, because I'm speaking with someone who is a product of what I visualized years ago of a program that focuses around community accountability and the hope that it can change one person's life. And it's like, well, it's done that. Maybe we could do 10 people's and 100. And now I think you can see as clearly as I can that we have uncovered in my opinion, the next pandemic.
Yeah.
And this is only the beginning of it. Of course, younger generations now don't focus as much on alcohol or cocaine, but there's different drugs. And that feeling that human beings have to escape reality is never going to stop. I don't think that will stop. It will get better, but in terms of alcohol and cocaine, but also gambling, porn, sugar, working, these are all things that people use as a tool. And, you know, as we do, we don't demonize alcohol or coke. It served its purpose. We just have to make the changes to make sure it doesn't have a purpose anymore. And the destruction stops. And over time, the compound interest of turning up and doing what improves our life just gets better and better and better. And I'm excited for you because you're, in comparison, there's things that are coming for you over the next few years, which I'm excited to watch and to be a part of. And I think it's also important because people might be listening to this and thinking, you know, we both work for a program which helps people, but it isn't the only way. There's a lot of different ways people can do these things. But one thing we know is we have a program which is incredibly effective.
It works.
It works, and we see that every day, and it's a beautiful thing to witness. But I think at the very least, like when you reached out to me, just having that space to be able to speak to someone and to unload. Everyone always thinks it's information. I'm lacking the secret. What is the secret? And information isn't what's lacking. It's just that space that you can be you, to let go of all that weight which you're carrying. And as we know, so many people always open with that question, is this 100% confidential? Because the fear of people finding out, the fear of my business, my work, my boss, my partner, my children, my friends, this can't get out, which is why we take our confidentiality so seriously, our NDAs, because that can be a huge fear for a lot of people. And I think just finding that space where you can trust, this is somewhere that I can just be me, just be open. And sometimes that's enough just to get the cogs turning of like, right, I'm now going to do what needs to be done. And it's a responsibility, as you said earlier, it's a responsibility because the stakes are high. But the most important thing that we can provide is just that space to provide an ear, to listen, to understand. There is no judgment, and I know you don't have any judgment.
How can you judge something that you've struggled with or been through yourself? And that's why there's so much compassion in the community, because everybody understands. And confidentiality is the last thing that anybody has to worry about, because it's such a tight-knit community that, you know, everybody is in there. They just want the best for themselves and for the people involved in the community. But the reason I think it's important that you've addressed is because it's one of the biggest concerns we hear. And by all accounts, you know, we work with higher profile people sometimes. That doesn't mean to say that lower profile people aren't also worrying about confidentiality. Everyone's worried about people finding out. And that for me was a plus point about this community, that if you do attend something like a local AA or NA meeting, for me it was a choice of my local village hall or my local church. I'm going to see people I know. Word's going to get around. And I'm very open about speaking about this subject now because I'm out of it. It doesn't occupy any of my brain space. I don't struggle anymore. I don't have any shame around it. I've become the person, or I'm becoming, this is a journey, becoming the person I want to be. But at one point I held a lot of shame. At one point I didn't want anybody to find out. When I first entered this program, the thought of people knowing was terrifying.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, man. Not anymore. And, you know, something I want to say to you is how incredibly grateful I am that you've changed my life, because I speak to you a lot now, but I don't often get the chance to say how incredibly grateful I am for that, because as we talked about earlier, in the nicest possible way, I was another call for you of somebody that wanted help. You speak to hundreds, thousands of people. But for me, that was a call that completely changed my life. And I'm now proud of the person I am, when for so many years I wasn't. And to sit here and say I love who I am is really powerful for me, because I really fell out of love with myself. I was doing behaviours and doing things that I wasn't proud of, and I really, really fell out of love with myself. So on a personal level, I'm incredibly grateful to have you in my life, and that I jumped on that call with you, because it's changed my life, man.
I'm proud of you too, man. I love that. What an incredible conversation. I've absolutely loved this.
It's interesting that we speak a lot, and we speak a lot logistically and about the business and how we can help more people. We don't often get to have a conversation like this, and actually I spend a lot of time these days supporting other people in their journey. Don't often get to share mine these days.
It's quite nice, right?
Yeah, it feels good. Feel very light.
It's so inspiring as well, because like I said at the beginning, knowing the story of how you got to where you are was not relevant in you getting to where you are now. As in, it's been years that I've known you, but you've told me a lot of things today that I didn't know. Whereas when someone thinks I need to get help, they think I need to talk about everything that's happened.
Irrelevant. And I learned that very quickly on in the Teetotal Trail, which was your past isn't irrelevant, but you can't change it. So hyper-focusing it isn't helpful. The only thing that we have autonomy and control over is our future. Our present, our future. We can change what is going to happen, but we can't change what has already happened. And that was a really interesting insight for me. It seems so obvious, but I hadn't thought about it. You know, you get told that you've almost got to dig into your past. And I'm not saying there isn't value in things like therapy. It's not what we do. What we do is we help people build a better and brighter future. And when I entered the Teetotal Trail, that was what I found out. Let's focus on your future, because that's the thing that you can change.
It's a great way to put it. And I am a big fan of therapy, and I believe it serves such an amazing purpose. However, I've never seen it effective in terms of breaking a habit, because breaking a habit needs consistency, accountability, and more than just an hour a week. You know, the amount of time that we have with people, you know, we run calls every day all over the world. We have 24-hour community spaces. We are currently in the process of building the app, which is almost ready, which is very exciting.
Very exciting.
And it just means that no one ever feels alone again, which for me was an overwhelming sense of, I'm alone in this. And that's, not only is it not enjoyable, but it's not helpful.
It's so true. And I just want to say one final thing.
Go on.
Which is, there'll be people listening to this that are on the edge of whether they should take action or not. And I listened. You had a podcast series that a lot of these podcasts you recorded years ago now, and I used to listen to them to and fro work, and I sat on the fence for so long about whether I should reach out for support or not, for so many different reasons. My brain telling me that I didn't need it, it was a weakness, were people going to find out, you know, all of these sorts of things. And I prolonged it, and I believe that was part of my journey. I wasn't meant to reach out at that point, but if you're on the fence, if anybody is on the fence and they're wondering whether they should reach out for support, that first call can't hurt, and that's what I discovered. Jump on a call, you know, with yourself and figure out whether it might work for them. Because what have you got to lose? You know, if you're listening to this and you're resonating with it, your life is already going in a direction that you're not happy with. So Christ, what have you got to lose for jumping on a call?
Couldn't have said it better myself. I've really enjoyed this.
It's been nice, man.
It's been a great conversation. I'm proud of you for getting to where you are today. And this is just the beginning.
It's just the beginning, man. Onwards and upwards.
Smashed it. Love it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It was a pleasure speaking to Chris, and I hope you found some value in it. I want you to know that if you're watching this and you find yourself resonating and you're struggling with alcohol or drugs, I can promise you, you are not alone, and there is a way to get out of this. I'm going to leave a link in the description below this video, and if you want to look around and learn a bit more about what it is that we do at the Teetotal Trail, or even more, you want to book a call with me or Chris or one of the other team members, you are more than welcome to, and trust me, it will help. I really hope you enjoyed this, but even more so, I really hope it helped.